Paranormal activity will probably be debated until the end of time. Those who see or hear things fear of telling others of their experiences, fearing they will be mocked for it. That is, of course, until a skeptic has a pants-pissing experience that alters their point of view. Enjoy. My friend's grandmother was out of town and asked us to check on her dog. She had a friendly German shepherd, jumping with excitement at the door when you showed up kind of dog. We went over, and to our surprise, found no dog waiting at the door. A little weird, but we thought nothing of it and went inside to find him. Got into the house and heard nothing. We start calling for the dog, Jake, and are answered with footsteps running down the stairs. We call out, assuming some other family member was there, but get no response. Now we start to freak out a little. We call his mom, and she assures us that no one is home and we're being ridiculous. More footsteps, but this time running up the stairs. I suggest the police. The house is being robbed, but my friend convinces me that we should check it out to be sure. So we make our way to the stairs and hear a bell chime. Buddy tells me the dog occasionally wears a bell, so it's probably Jake. We get to the door which leads to the stairs and see there's a small bell around the handle. My friend is terrified, and so am I. But we're trying to play it cool, so I lead us up the stairs. At the top, we see Jake the dog laying in a chair, shaking and obviously terrified. We couldn't get him to move no matter what we did. He just kept staring down the stairs. We searched the entire house and found nothing and no one. It's the only time in my life I've been genuinely afraid I was dealing with something paranormal. Friend's grandmother assures us to this day it was her husband, and that she still hears him walking around and talking from time to time. And I lived in a house with a bunch of my friends. We always said the house was haunted. We all just had so many eerie experiences. We all agreed one spirit was one of a young playful girl, and the other was of an angry old man. There was a shed in the backyard that had locks on the inside. We always imagined what bad things had happened in there. One day, me and a friend are sitting outside on the porch steps, both of us quiet. Everyone else is downstairs. I hear a very old sounding from behind my shoulder, where the wall of the house is. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to seem crazy. But out of my peripheral vision, I see my friend glance over his shoulder. So I say, "You heard that too?" And he says, "You mean an old man going heh heh heh?" I concurred, and we both noped down to the basement where everyone still was. The most terrifying paranormal experience I ever had happened in my grandma's guest room. I was young. I remember staying in that room, and every time I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sensation of someone or something running their fingers up my spine. I would be fully awake, but too petrified to move. This happened every single time I stayed in that room. When I was in middle school, my parents ended up moving into my grandma's house, and guess what? My sister and I had to share that room. I thought things would be different, but every so often, I would wake up and experience that sensation again. At one point, I even shot up and looked around the room, only to find nothing in sight. I'd lay down again and try to sleep, but there it was again. The feeling of someone running their fingers up and down my spine. It got to the point where I was just laying in bed trying to sleep, and it would just happen. You'd think that something like this wouldn't be scary, but there was just something about that feeling that made me feel terrified, as if I were getting touched inappropriately by a stranger. There was nothing I could really do to make it stop. All I could do was lay there and wait until it was over. I'm happy to say that I don't experience that anymore in the room. And I worked at a movie theater for a few years in high school. Throughout my time there, I was always told of the ghost named Fred who haunted Screen 5. There were always weird things happening in that theater. The screen randomly flickering despite changing the projectors. It was colder in there than anywhere else, stuff like that. The doors to the building would randomly open and close sometimes too. The story behind Fred was that he was an old custodian who worked cleaning the theater overnight. He was very religious and kept a rosary with him. He died of a heart attack, and somehow his rosary ended up hanging next to Projector 5. A few years later, the theater was remodeled, and one of the managers took the rosary as a joke. On his way home, he crashed, his car rolling down a ditch, leaving him with moderate injuries. The next day, the rosary was back hanging by the projector, with no one knowing how it got there. When I was 8, I was with my mom, visiting one of her friends. I was playing with toys while her and her friend were talking, when a rubber ball, the kind you used in gym class for dodgeball, comes rolling down the stairs, stopping right on the bottom stair. All three of us stop and look at it for a moment. That's when my smart-ass mother says, "Okay, but can you throw it?" The ball proceeds to go flying across the room and breaks a window. So yeah, we got the fuck out of that house very fast. As a young teenager, I had a really scary nightmare in the middle of the night. In the dream, I was sitting on my parents' bed and looking in their mirror. In the mirror, I saw a woman sitting behind me with dead-looking eyes and long, black stringy hair covering her face. In the dream, I turned around and no one was there. When I turned back around to the mirror, she was even closer. This was probably around 1999 or so, and at that point, I hadn't seen a lot of scary movies that used that effect, so it scared the absolute shit out of me. I woke up from the nightmare, and my bed started shaking violently. I had a daybed with a metal frame, and it felt like a fully grown adult was standing at the end of the bed, shaking it back and forth with all of their might. This went on for several minutes, and I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't even make a noise. Then it suddenly stopped, and I couldn't make myself move for a few minutes after that. I finally managed to jump out of bed and run to my parents' room and wake them up to tell them what had just happened. They told me I was dreaming, and they didn't believe me. It was and still is so very clearly and solidly real to me, and I have no idea what it was. My 2-year-old was really sick and throwing up about every half hour one night, so I stayed up with her so I could keep an eye on her. We were sitting on the couch in the family room around 11 p.m. I was watching TV, and she had dozed off in my lap. I thought about getting up to close the blinds and the glass double doors. They lead into the backyard, but I didn't want to disturb my daughter. I was kind of staring off, lost in my own thoughts, when I realized I was actually staring at something odd. It looked like a face was peering back at me through the glass door. My heart started to race as I snapped to attention and realized to my horror that there was a face staring back at me. It looked like a man's face, but because it was so dark out, it was hard to make out any features. The face didn't move, but it looked like he or it had a small, creepy smile. The eyes also looked slightly red. Not glowing red, but swollen. I didn't see a body, just a face. Also, it was kind of low, as if he were crouched down. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen with fear. I glanced to the TV and pretended to be watching it as I thought of a plan. As I briefly glanced back at the face, it was gone. This scared me even more than if it had still been there. Eventually, I began to relax. I convinced myself that it was just some sort of illusion brought on by exhaustion and the way the lights in the room reflected against the glass. About 15 minutes later, I glanced at the glass doors again and saw something that made my blood run cold. Something was hanging off the side of the door. It was on the outside of the door, and it looked like some huge, shadowy man-monkey thing hanging there by an arm and gently swinging to and fro, like a kid would swing on stall doors in a public bathroom. But what really scared me was the weird smile and the red swollen eyes on the thing's head. And I didn't care if this was an illusion. I was done. I bundled up my daughter in my arms and ran from the house. I went over to my neighbors and her husband offered to check around my house. He said he didn't find anything when he returned, something I figured would happen. I never saw anything like that again, but I did hear weird noises in my bedroom that night. We own a house that used to be a funeral home decades ago. My wife lives there full time, but due to my job, I'm not there as much. So I was lying in bed, and I remember being awoken by a turn signal colored amber light in my eyes. That didn't make sense, and I rolled over onto my back. It was then that a face appeared through the door to the bedroom, in the same amber hue as the light that woke me. Best I could describe was a tiki mask. I grabbed my wife's arm really hard and she yelped. The face turned the slightest bit toward her, then back through the door. She asked why I woke her. After I explained, she said, "Yeah, just tell it to leave you alone and it stops." Apparently, it's a fairly common occurrence. As a kid, we played in the basement a lot. The floor was open and cement, so we could roller skate around. Also, the walls were either dirt or bricks, so we were allowed to shoot BB guns at targets. Basically, I wasn't scared of the basement at all as a kid. One day, my sister was in a side room that had jars of peaches and pickles. Dirt cellar type room. Stayed cold even in the summer. She wouldn't let me in, and I was sure she was eating peaches. I could see her feet under the crack of the door, so I stuck my fingers under, and she messed around with my fingers and giggled. I felt that her fingers were wet, and I said, "Don't eat all the peaches, I want some." Then she pushed down on my fingers so hard. It hurt, and she was grunting and freaking out. I started screaming and tugging. Finally, I pulled my hand back, and she was quiet for a moment before she hauled off and kicked the door really hard. I ran upstairs to tell her, and there she was with my mom in the kitchen. It was pretty fucking freaky, and no one believed me. In fact, my mom just said my imagination had gotten away from me and to forget all about it. It started out with relatively harmless things, like voices and footsteps, but it got progressively worse. There were several friends that came over who heard or saw things they couldn't explain. I had 2 friends who absolutely refused to set foot in my house again after seeing something that terrified them. Although I lived in that house for 2 years, it wasn't until the last year that things got really bad. One night I was sleeping in my bedroom, which of course was in the basement. I woke up to whispers that were a lot louder than I'd ever heard before. Then my bed started moving. It wasn't shaking like you see in a horror movie, but instead, it was moving as if something big was underneath it and crawling around. I could feel whatever it was pushing up against the mattress. I was honestly so scared that I couldn't even open my mouth to make a noise. It seemed like time was dragging on forever, and my head was pounding from being shocked. Realistically, it was probably only 30 seconds, until I took a flying leap out of my bed and bolted up the stairs into my mom's room on the top floor. The next day, she helped me drag my mattress up 2 flights of stairs to the room of her floor. I was 15, and I was so terrified of that house that I slept on her floor until the lease was up and we moved. As we were moving, our landlord was telling us how he was having trouble finding more tenants because people were too superstitious to live in the neighborhood. What nobody had ever mentioned to us was that the neighborhood was built in a relocated cemetery, except that there were still a few headstones and bodies forgotten in the far end of the neighborhood. The last I checked, the house was still on the market as the owner had claimed bankruptcy and nobody ever wanted the house. To be honest, I have so many stories from living there, it still makes me worry at night. I'm still terrified of the dark to this day. At 18 years old, I sleep with the lights on every night. Some things in the world just can't be explained. Well, what about you? Would you dismiss the first feeling of an unseen hand touching you? Would you laugh as you mocked the voices warning you? Or hide under the covers and pray it would just all go away? See you next time.